There is a moment, a very specific, fragile moment, when your life hasn't fallen apart yet, but something inside you already knows it will. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet. And that quiet is what makes it terrifying. For me, it began with the absence of a kiss. For 9 years, Ethan kissed my forehead every morning before leaving for work. It wasn't passionate, it wasn't cinematic. It was routine. Soft lips against skin, the scent of his cologne lingering for a second, his palm resting briefly at the back of my neck. "Don't work too hard," he would murmur, and I would smile. That morning he grabbed his keys and walked out. No kiss, no murmur, just the click of the door shutting. I stood in the kitchen, coffee cup warming my fingers, staring at the empty doorway longer than necessary. My chest felt tight, but I told myself not to be dramatic. People forget kisses. People have stressful days. People change, but they don't change overnight, they fade. And fading is harder to fight than betrayal. At first, the changes were small enough to excuse. He started taking his phone into the bathroom. He angled the screen away when he typed. He laughed at messages but never shared what was funny. Once I passed behind him while he was sitting on the couch. A woman's name flashed across his screen before he quickly minimized it. Clara. I froze. The name wasn't unfamiliar.
Clara was the girl from his college years, the one he used to describe with a nostalgic half-smile. "She was my first love," he'd once said casually while we were dating. "We were too young. It didn't work out." I never felt threatened by her. She belonged to a different era of his life, a sepia-toned memory. Or so I thought. When I asked about the message, he didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. "You're reading into things," said. "I just saw her name." So? We reconnected. It's not illegal to talk to someone. His tone wasn't defensive. It was dismissive. And somehow that hurt more. The emotional distance grew. Dinner conversations became surface level. "How was your day?" "Fine. How was yours?" "Busy." He stopped reaching for my hand when we watched television. He stopped asking about my projects. He stopped noticing when I changed my hair. The house felt colder. I started doubting myself. Was I boring? Was I too focused on work? Was I not exciting enough anymore? Gaslighting doesn't always come as obvious manipulation. Sometimes it's just subtle withdrawal, enough to make you question your own value. One night I tried to bridge the gap. We were sitting at the dining table, plates half finished between us. "I feel like you're far away lately," I said gently. He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Can we not do this?" "Do what?" "Turn everything into a problem." "I'm not turning it into a problem. I'm trying to understand." "There's nothing to understand." His voice hardened, and I realized something uncomfortable. He didn't want to fix anything. He wanted distance. The first time he didn't come home, I felt it before I saw the clock. It was 11:47 p.m., then 12:30, then 1:12 a.m. A text appeared. "Staying at a friend's, don't wait up." No explanation, no apology, just a statement. I didn't sleep. I lay on my side of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me. I pressed my palm against the mattress where he usually lay. Cold. That was when I understood something that terrified me more than cheating. He had emotionally left before physically leaving. The next morning, he returned calm. Too calm. He showered, dressed, and made coffee as if nothing had shifted. I watched him carefully. "You could have called," I said quietly. I texted. "At 1 a.m. You're overreacting." There it was. That word, overreacting, a convenient way to shrink someone's feelings. The confrontation came 2 weeks later. It was raining that evening. Heavy, relentless rain that blurred the city lights outside our windows. He stood by the glass, phone in hand, typing quickly, smiling. Not the polite smile he gave colleagues. This was softer, warmer, intimate. Something inside me snapped into clarity. "Are you in love with her?" I asked. He didn't deny it immediately, and that silence told me everything. He turned slowly. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I hadn't seen in years. Seeing Clara again made me realize something. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. "What?" He hesitated. "I don't think I was ever truly in love with you." The room felt suddenly smaller. "I cared about you," he continued almost gently. "I still do. But what I feel with her, it's different. It's real." Real. As if our marriage had been rehearsal. 9 years, holidays, illnesses, career setbacks, shared savings accounts, shared dreams. And suddenly I was a placeholder. "Was I just convenient?" I asked. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" He avoided my eyes. "I think I convinced myself this was enough," he said quietly. "But now I know what real love feels like." There's a cruelty in calm honesty. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't blaming me. He was simply choosing someone else. "I want a divorce," he said. Just like that. No counseling, no hesitation. A decision already made. "I didn't choose this," I whispered. "I know." That hurt the most. His certainty. The weeks that followed felt surreal. He moved out quickly. Clothes disappeared from the closet. Shoes vanished from the entryway. His side of the bathroom counter emptied. The house echoed. Friends reacted in predictable ways. Some avoided me, uncomfortable with the messiness. Some said, "At least you found out now," as if 9 years wasn't already too long. And some, the worst ones, said, "Well, she was his first love," as if nostalgia justifies betrayal. The legal process was efficient, too efficient. He wanted it finalized before the end of the quarter. Clara and he had plans, investments, trips, a new apartment. I signed papers I never imagined signing. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry in the lawyer's office. I saved that for later. The final hearing was anticlimactic. A judge confirmed what my heart already knew. Marriage dissolved, just like that. No dramatic music, no collapse, just paperwork. When we stepped outside the courthouse, rain began to fall again. He looked almost relieved. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I studied his face carefully. "I believe you," I replied. Because the truth was worse. He hadn't meant to hurt me. He just meant to choose himself. And in doing so, he erased me. He hesitated as if expecting tears. A scene, something. But I was empty. "You'll find someone," he added awkwardly. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was ironic. He had already replaced me. He didn't realize that losing him would force me to find myself. But that would come later. At that moment, I was just a woman standing in the rain, holding divorce papers, trying to understand how love could evaporate so quietly. I watched him walk toward his car. He didn't look back. And that was the exact second I understood something painful and freeing. You cannot compete with a fantasy. And Clara wasn't a woman to him. She was a memory, and memories are easy to romanticize. I went home to an empty house that no longer felt like mine. I stood in front of the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me looked composed, but her eyes were different, wider, wounded, awake. I didn't choose this, I whispered to my reflection. But somewhere deep inside, another voice responded, no, but you will choose what comes next. And that terrified me more than the divorce itself. There's something uniquely humiliating about being replaced by a memory. If he had left me for someone new, someone unexpected, spontaneous, maybe it would have hurt differently. Maybe I could have blamed chemistry, timing, fate. But Clara wasn't new. She was unfinished, and unfinished stories are dangerous because they leave room for imagination. 2 weeks after he moved out, their relationship became public. Not quietly, not respectfully. Public. The first photo appeared on social media on a Sunday afternoon. I remember because I was reorganizing kitchen cabinets, trying to create the illusion of control in a life that suddenly had none. My phone vibrated, a message from an old mutual friend. Have you seen this? There it was, Ethan and Clara, at a rooftop restaurant, his hand on her waist, her head tilted toward him like she'd always belonged there. The caption read, "Some love stories deserve a second chance." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Second chance. As if our marriage had been an interruption. As if I had been the pause between chapters. The comments flooded in. So meant to be. Finally, true love always finds its way back. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just felt erased. Clara didn't just step back into his life. She reclaimed it publicly. Within weeks, she was at events he used to attend with me. Charity galas, corporate dinners, networking parties. She wore confidence like perfume. Subtle, but intentional. The first time I saw them together in person after the separation was at a foundation fundraiser I couldn't avoid. My name was still on the board. Avoiding it would have meant shrinking, and I refused to shrink. I wore a navy silk dress, understated, structured, not armor, but close. When I entered the ballroom, I saw them immediately. They weren't even trying to be discreet. She was laughing, head thrown back, fingers lightly resting on his chest. He looked younger, or maybe just reckless. When he noticed me, something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, not regret, awkwardness. Clara followed his gaze. Her eyes landed on me. She didn't look surprised. She looked curious, like a scientist observing a specimen. After a few minutes, she approached me, alone, bold. "I hope this isn't uncomfortable," she said softly. Her voice was smooth, controlled. I met her eyes. "It's not," I replied. That wasn't entirely true, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. She studied me carefully. "You and Ethan built something stable," she continued. "I respect that." Respect. An interesting choice of word. But sometimes stability isn't passion. There it was. The narrative. I tilted my head slightly. And sometimes passion isn't stability. Her smile tightened. Just barely. "You seem strong," she said. "You'll land on your feet." I almost laughed, as if I were a business investment that had temporarily underperformed. "Enjoy your evening," I said calmly. I walked away before she could respond, but I could feel her watching me, measuring, comparing. Later that night, Ethan cornered me near the bar. "I didn't expect you to come," he said. "It's still my board," I replied. He nodded. "You look good." I didn't thank him. "You look certain," I said instead. He hesitated. "It's just different with her." "Different how?" He ran a hand through his hair. The nervous gesture again. "She reminds me of who I used to be." That was the first honest thing he'd said. He wasn't in love with Clara. He was in love with his younger self, with who he felt like when life was simpler, when responsibilities were lighter, when ambition wasn't heavy. Clara represented freedom, and I represented adulthood. "You don't miss us?" I asked quietly. He looked away. "I think we were comfortable." Comfortable, as if comfort were a flaw. "I need something that makes me feel alive," he added. Alive, as if our years together had been death. I swallowed the sting. "I hope it stays alive," I said, because I already sensed something fragile in their dynamic. It was too intense, too nostalgic, too performative. Real love doesn't need an audience, but they always seem to have one. The divorce finalized shortly after that event, and that's when the financial reality hit. He had pushed aggressively during negotiations, investments, liquidity, asset distribution. "I need flexibility right now," he'd said. Flexibility. Translation: Claire and I have plans. I kept the house, but the mortgage weighed heavily. He kept most of the capital. I didn't fight as hard as I could have, not because I was weak, but because I wanted out clean. I didn't want to stay tethered to him through money. Still, the imbalance stung. A few weeks later, news spread that he and Claire had invested in a startup together. Travel photos followed: Italy, Paris, coastal villas. She posted poetic captions about destiny, about timing, about when the universe restores what was always yours. I muted her, but muting doesn't stop people from sending screenshots. "You okay?" friends would text. I stopped answering, because I wasn't okay. But I refused to narrate my pain for public consumption. The real humiliation came unexpectedly. A mutual acquaintance, someone I had once mentored professionally, casually said during lunch, "I always thought he settled with you." Settled. The word hit harder than I expected. Settled, I repeated evenly. "Well, Clara was his big love, right? You were more practical." Practical, like a reliable sedan, not a sports car. I smiled politely, but inside something shifted, not anger, awakening, because that was the narrative being written about me. I was the safe choice, the stable chapter, the intermission, and I had allowed it. I had built my identity around being dependable, supportive, unshakable. I had never demanded to be desired. I had only demanded to be respected. And apparently that wasn't enough for him. But here's what Clara didn't understand, and what Ethan would eventually learn. Nostalgia fades, real life doesn't. They were living in a highlight reel. No bills in the frame, no ordinary Tuesdays, no shared silence without background music, just adrenaline. And adrenaline cannot sustain a lifetime. One evening, months after the divorce, I ran into Ethan alone at a cafe. No Clara. He looked tired. "Hey," he said. "Hey." There was an awkward pause. "How are you?" he asked. "Working," I replied. He nodded slowly. "She's intense," he admitted suddenly. I raised an eyebrow. "Intense?" "She wants everything now. Big moves, big risks. And you?" I thought I wanted that too. But his tone lacked conviction. I saw it then. The hairline crack, the first fracture in the fantasy. Clara thrived on nostalgia, but nostalgia demands constant performance. And Ethan was beginning to realize he had to keep proving himself worthy of a past that no longer existed. I didn't gloat. I didn't comfort him either. I simply said, "Be careful not to confuse excitement with compatibility." He stared at me for a moment. "You've changed." "No," I replied softly. "I've clarified." And I left him sitting there. For the first time since the divorce, I felt something unexpected. Not heartbreak, not bitterness. Perspective. Because Clara hadn't stolen him. She had activated something that was already restless inside him. And if a marriage can be dismantled by nostalgia, then it was never built on solidity to begin with. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave it structure, and structure is the first step toward rebuilding. By the end of that year, I understood something clearly. Clara wasn't my competition. She was his mirror. She reflected who he wanted to believe he still was. And I had been the woman who saw him as he actually was. Responsible, flawed, human. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. And there's a difference, a dangerous one. People assume the hardest part of divorce is the betrayal. It isn't. The hardest part is the silence afterward, when the adrenaline fades, when the anger softens, when the world continues moving as if nothing catastrophic has happened. But your internal structure has collapsed. The house felt too large after Ethan left. At first I told myself I could keep it, that it was symbolic, that walking away would feel like another loss. But symbols don't pay mortgages, and empty rooms echo louder than arguments ever did. I remember the night I finally admitted I couldn't afford to keep it. I was sitting at the kitchen island, the same place where he'd once told me he wanted a divorce. The overhead lights were too bright. My laptop screen glowed with numbers. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, maintenance. My income was steady but not yet strong enough to absorb everything alone. I had built my consulting career around flexibility, prioritizing his corporate relocations, his schedule, his networking dinners. Now flexibility felt like fragility. I closed my laptop and just stared. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like evidence. Evidence that I had invested fully in something that didn't survive. I walked upstairs and stood in our old bedroom. The indent of our bed had long since flattened. The closet was half empty, but his absence still felt physical, like a missing wall. I didn't lose him, I whispered to myself, but it didn't feel true yet. 2 weeks later, I listed the house. The day the real estate agent took photos, I removed every trace of us. Framed wedding pictures, travel souvenirs. The small ceramic bowl we'd bought on our honeymoon. I packed them into boxes labeled simply, Before. The house sold faster than I expected. Young couple, newly engaged, excited. They stood in the living room holding hands, talking about paint colors. I watched from the hallway. There was no jealousy, just a strange sense of déjà vu. That used to be us, hopeful, certain, naive. When I handed over the keys, I felt something close. Not dramatically, not with tears, just quietly. A chapter ending without applause. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment across town. The building was older. The floors creaked. The window faced a brick wall only a few feet away. No skyline, no yard, no memories. The first night, I sat on the floor surrounded by unopened boxes. There was no bed yet, no couch, just me and the hum of a radiator. I remember thinking, this is what starting over actually looks like. It isn't glamorous. It isn't empowering. It's lonely. I cried that night, not loudly, not theatrically, but in short, controlled waves. The kind you allow yourself because no one is watching. And somewhere between the tears and the silence, a realization formed. No one was coming to save me. Not friends, not family, not a new romance. This rebuild would be mine, and that terrified me. Financial pressure sharpened everything. I took on contracts I would have once declined. High-demand projects, unstable startups, late-night strategy sessions, I worked weekends. I worked through headaches. I worked through exhaustion because survival leaves little room for emotional indulgence. But grief doesn't disappear just because you're busy. It hides in small moments. Like when I reached for my phone to share good news and remember there was no one on the other end who cared in that particular way. Or when I walked past couples holding hands and felt an involuntary ache in my chest. Therapy became my anchor. At first I resisted it. I didn't want to sit in a room and dissect my pain. But one afternoon after a panic attack in my car, triggered by seeing Ethan and Clara's engagement announcement online, I made the call. Dr. Hayes was calm, unimpressed by drama, grounded. In our third session, she said something that cracked me open. "You're grieving not just a marriage," she said. "You're grieving the identity you built within it." I stared at her. Identity. She was right. For 9 years, I had been Ethan's wife, supportive, stable, reliable. My ambitions existed, but they were adjusted around his. What if I wasn't enough? I asked her once. For him? She clarified. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. Or what if he wasn't capable of sustaining something steady? That question lingered. What if his departure wasn't a verdict on my value, but a revelation of his restlessness? Slowly, my self-perception began to shift, not dramatically, but deliberately. Professionally, something unexpected started happening. Freed from compromise, I began making bolder decisions. I stopped underselling my expertise. I raised my rates. I stopped apologizing in emails. Instead of writing, "Sorry for the delay," I wrote, "Thank you for your patience." It sounds small, but language reshapes identity. I invested in advanced certifications. I attended conferences alone. I spoke on panels. The first time I stood behind a podium addressing a room full of executives, my hands trembled slightly, but my voice didn't. I spoke about restructuring failing organizations, about identifying blind spots in leadership, about the danger of nostalgia in business, how companies often romanticize their golden years instead of adapting. Halfway through my talk, I realized the metaphor wasn't accidental. I wasn't just speaking about corporations. I was speaking about my marriage, and something inside me settled. Applause followed, not overwhelming, but real. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as someone's wife, but as myself. Months passed, then a year. Ethan and Clara married in a small but lavish ceremony abroad. The photos were curated. Perfect lighting, perfect smiles. She wore a vintage-inspired gown. He looked proud. I didn't attend. I didn't comment. I didn't react publicly. But privately, I watched. Because healing doesn't mean indifference overnight. It means watching without collapsing. By then, I had moved into a slightly better apartment. I had hired my first assistant. My client list was growing. The nights were still quiet, but no longer suffocating. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels like lack. Solitude feels like space. I was beginning to feel space. The true turning point came unexpectedly. A major client, a mid-sized tech firm, approached me to lead a restructuring initiative. It was risky. If I failed, my reputation would suffer. If I succeeded, it would elevate everything. Old me would have hesitated. This version of me said yes. The project consumed 6 months of my life. Long meetings, board negotiations, conflict mediation. I saw in their leadership team the same dysfunction I had once ignored in my marriage. Avoidance, ego, romanticizing how things used to be. I addressed it directly, firmly. without fear of being too much. When the company stabilized, when profits rebounded and internal morale improved, they credited my strategy publicly. Word spread, referrals multiplied, and suddenly I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. One evening, standing alone in my apartment, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was sharper, not colder, but defined. There was grief in her history, but not in her posture. I realized something subtle yet powerful. Losing everything had stripped me of illusion. It removed dependency. It forced clarity, and clarity is strength. I thought about Ethan that night, not with longing, but with analysis. He had left seeking intensity, excitement, a version of himself preserved in memory. But intensity fades. Excitement requires constant escalation. And nostalgia cannot survive daily reality forever. I wondered, briefly, if he felt it yet, if cracks had begun forming, if Clara's intensity had turned into pressure. But those thoughts no longer consumed me, because my life was no longer defined by his choices. It was defined by mine. By the end of the second year, my consulting practice became an official firm. I signed the lease on a modest but elegant office space downtown. Glass walls, natural light, a view of the skyline. When I received the keys, I stood alone in the empty room. The city stretched beneath me, alive, unapologetic. I placed my hand against the cool glass. 2 years ago, I had handed over keys to a house that symbolized loss. Now I was receiving keys to something built entirely by me. No one had gifted this. No one had chosen me into it. I had earned it. And for the first time since the divorce, I felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude, not for the pain, but for the evolution it demanded. Because sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what you're capable of rebuilding. And I was just getting started. There is a quiet kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't post victories. It doesn't prove points. It doesn't circle back for validation. It simply becomes. By the 3rd year after the divorce, I no longer counted time in before and after. I counted it in growth. The grief had softened, not vanished, but integrated, like a scar that no longer hurts, but reminds you of what you survived. Therapy had stopped feeling like recovery and started feeling like refinement. One afternoon, Dr. Hayes asked me something unexpected. If Ethan walked back into your life today, who would he meet? I didn't answer immediately, because that question wasn't about him. It was about me. He wouldn't meet the woman who begged for clarity at a rain-streaked window. He wouldn't meet the woman who shrank her ambitions to accommodate someone else's comfort. He wouldn't meet the woman who equated loyalty with self-sacrifice. He would meet someone else entirely, someone who no longer negotiates her worth. That realization changed everything. Professionally, my firm was thriving. But success wasn't just measured in revenue. It was measured in posture, in how I entered rooms, in how I spoke without softening my conclusions to make others comfortable. The first time I declined a client because their values didn't align with mine, I felt a strange surge of pride. Old me would have compromised. New me chose alignment over approval. And people noticed, not loudly, but consistently. Invitations increased, panels, advisory roles, private strategy sessions with executives who once would have dismissed me. I wasn't loud, I wasn't aggressive, but I was precise, and precision commands respect. It was at a leadership summit in early autumn that I met Daniel. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic slow motion, Just a quiet introduction over coffee between sessions. He didn't introduce himself as a CEO. He said, "Hi, I'm Daniel." That alone told me something. Men who lead with titles usually hide behind them. He didn't. We spoke about market volatility at first, then about leadership psychology, then, unexpectedly, about burnout. "You ever feel like you built something impressive?" he said thoughtfully, "but it almost cost you your life?" I studied him carefully. He wasn't fishing for admiration. He was asking a real question. "Yes," I replied. "And sometime you build something impressive because you lost something first." He looked at me then, really looked at me, not assessing, not evaluating, just listening. It had been a long time since I felt that kind of attention. Not desire. Attention. There's a difference. We didn't rush anything. Coffee turned into dinner weeks later. Dinner turned into long conversations. He never pried about my divorce. He never asked invasive questions about Ethan. One evening, when I voluntarily mentioned it, he listened without interruption. When I finished, he simply said, "You deserve someone who saw you clearly." No defensiveness, no comparison, no subtle competition, just acknowledgement. It unsettled me at first, not because he was wrong, but because I wasn't used to that kind of steady presence. With Ethan, love had been performance, subtle but constant. With Daniel, it was grounding. He wasn't intense. He was consistent. He didn't chase. He showed up. When I had a high-pressure board meeting, he sent one message: "Breathe. You don't need to prove anything." When I doubted myself before launching a major expansion, he asked, "What would you advise a client in your position?" He reflected my strength back to me instead of trying to replace it. And that was new. The first time he held my hand, it wasn't possessive. It was protective. We were crossing a busy street after dinner, his fingers intertwined with mine naturally. No dramatic spark, no fireworks, just warmth. And for the first time in years, my nervous system felt calm. That's how I knew it was real. Because trauma bonds feel electric. Healthy bonds feel safe. Around that time, I heard through professional circles that Ethan's second marriage wasn't as perfect as it looked online. Investments had failed. Clara had pushed for aggressive expansion. There were rumors of tension. I didn't search for confirmation. I didn't ask mutual friends, because I had stopped needing updates. One evening, Daniel and I were standing in my office overlooking the city. He stood behind me, arms loosely around my waist. "Do you ever regret anything?" he asked softly. I thought about it carefully. "I regret shrinking," I said finally, "not loving." He nodded against my hair. "That's growth." And it was, because I no longer wished the past had unfolded differently. If Ethan hadn't left, if Clara hadn't reappeared, if I hadn't lost the house, I might still be orbiting someone else's ambition. I might still be apologizing for taking up space. Loss had been brutal, but it had been clarifying. Daniel proposed quietly. No spectacle, no audience, just us at home after dinner. He knelt not because tradition demanded it, but because he wanted to. "I don't want to own you," he said softly. "I want to stand beside you." That sentence undid me more than any grand declaration could have. Tears came, not from fear of losing him, but from understanding what partnership actually feels like. We married in a small ceremony overlooking the ocean. No dramatic vows, no public spectacle, just intention. When he placed the ring off my finger, it didn't feel like a claim. It felt like alignment. Years passed. My firm expanded internationally. His company stabilized after a difficult restructuring. We supported each other without merging identities. I didn't become Daniel's wife. I remained myself, and he loved that. One rainy afternoon, ironic, almost poetic, Ethan appeared outside my office building. Thinner, older, the sharp edges of confidence dulled. I stepped outside calmly. "I made a mistake," he said immediately. No small talk, no pride left. "I thought nostalgia was love," he admitted. "I was wrong." I studied him carefully. There was sincerity there, but also desperation. Clara had left him months earlier after financial losses. Their second chance had fractured under real life. "You were the love of my life," he said. It was the sentence I once would have shattered for. Now it landed gently, without impact. "You loved how I made you feel stable," I replied evenly. "You loved how she made you feel young." He flinched. "And now?" He hesitated. "Now I just feel alone." Honesty. But loneliness isn't love. The glass doors behind me opened. Daniel stepped outside. Not aggressive, not territorial, just present. His hand rested lightly at the base of my spine. Grounding. Ethan's eyes flickered between us. "I lost everything," he whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No, you traded it." Silence stretched between us. Rain soaked his coat. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. Peaceful, irreversible distance. "I hope you find what you're actually looking for," I said softly, and then I turned. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just decisively. Inside, Daniel handed me my umbrella. "You okay?" he asked. I smiled. "I've never been clearer." Here's what no one tells you about karma. It isn't revenge. It's alignment. When you choose yourself, the universe rearranges accordingly. Ethan didn't come back because I became successful. He came back because he realized stability isn't boring. It's rare. Clara didn't win. I didn't lose. We were simply chapters in his lesson, but I became the author of mine. And that is the difference. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone walked away thinking you were replaceable, remember this: you cannot compete with a fantasy, but you can become undeniable in reality. And sometimes the greatest glow up isn't louder success, it's quieter standards. He forced a divorce, but he also forced my evolution. And now, I am not the woman he left. I am the woman he can never return to.